It's interesting because on our Africa channel of the podcast, we've been talking with a lot of scholars and experts leading up to the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit that's going to take place in the first week of September. And one of the complaints, the pleas, I don't know what the word is that they're calling for, the desires is that African countries develop a strategic framework to engage China. And I think that's where the Vietnamese have done well. Bamboo diplomacy is part of a strategic framework that is thought out. The think tanks here are ordered to kind of fill in the gaps on it. Universities, they fill in the gaps on it. And there is strategic thinking in how to balance out the major powers.
Yes, I think it also misses some of the realities of life in the Global South. Makes it kind of more harder, I think, for Global North stakeholders to understand exactly what's going on and why some of these countries make the choices they do. One of them being why they work with China so much, because of course China is such a strong example of this kind of development, which is this combination of a very strong state, authoritarian state, with very strong development outcomes. And of course, that's not true for all authoritarian states. And therefore, it's really important, I think, to draw distinctions between these different countries.
We have seen that bamboo diplomacy has been quite successful, allowing Vietnam to enhance ties with competing powers without serious consequences. Like, for instance, Vietnam upgraded relationship with the US without Chinese overt negative reaction. And similarly, despite US criticism of Vietnam's hosting of Putin, right, the US quickly sent Assistant Secretary of State Daniel Kritenbrink to Vietnam, and then he emphasized the high level of trust in Vietnam-US relations. So I think that Vietnam sees bamboo diplomacy is a key instrument for Vietnam to ensure its survival in an increasingly polarized geopolitical environment.
The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus Van Staden, now in Cape Town, South Africa. After a long move, you have finally arrived in one of the most beautiful cities on earth. Welcome to your new home, Cobus.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, it's wonderful for you to be back. In some ways, I have to get used to this now because way back in the day when we started this podcast in the early 2010s, you were in Cape Town. And now here we are again, all over.
Yeah, the South African rhythm back and forth between Johannesburg and Cape Town.
What's old is new. Okay, so listen, today's show, we're going to focus on my neighborhood out here in Southeast Asia, specifically in Vietnam. We don't do that very often, but there's been so much going on. It's been a dramatic year, maybe year and a half here in Vietnam. Back in July 19th to be precise, we had the passing of Vietnamese Communist Party General Secretary Nguyen Phu Trong. Now, to most people outside of Southeast Asia, he is probably not well known. I don't think that's a name that you ever really paid that much attention to, Cobus, in Africa. No one ever really heard of Trong, did they?
Not really, no.
No, I wouldn't think so much. But he was very much a central figure in turning Vietnam what it is today. In fact, a lot of the coverage of his passing focused on how Ho Chi Minh liberated the country. This is what people here would say. So Ho Chi Minh, liberated the country. General Giap defended the country. He fought the wars against the French and the Americans. And then they say Nguyen Phu Trong developed the country. After rising to power in 2011, Trong stayed on as general secretary for 3 terms. Now, that was unusual. And during this period, he also acted as the president from 2018 to 2021. Again, he held 2 posts, which made them unusual in that respect as well. Power in Vietnam is very different than it is in China, where in China, everything is consolidated under Xi Jinping. He's the president, he's the chairman of the Central Military Commission, he's the general secretary of the Communist Party, and the number of titles that Xi has is just endless. Whereas in Vietnam, power is distributed across the general secretary of the Communist Party, the president, the prime minister, and the head of the National Assembly. But under Trong, he grew the economy to the point where GDP more than doubled. He is also the architect of Vietnam's foreign policy doctrine known as bamboo diplomacy that is widely admired in many parts of the world, particularly in middle power countries, for success in balancing ties with the major powers. And Cobus, this is a concept that you may not know Trong, but bamboo diplomacy is something that is now increasingly well known throughout the global South. It's basically another way of saying strategic autonomy. And the Vietnamese have been very effective at maintaining robust ties with the US, with China, with Russia, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and most of the other major powers here in Asia. And trust me when I tell you that in this part of the world, that is a very difficult thing to do. Don't forget that over the past 12 months, just the past 12 months, Vietnam is the only country in the world to play host to Joe Biden, Xi Jinping, and Vladimir Putin. Now, there's been a lot of coverage about Trom's passing, but in the US and European media, there was a slightly different take on his passing than there was, say, out here in Asia. The New York Times correspondent Sui Li Wei opened her obituary of Trong by describing him as the hardline general secretary of Vietnam's Communist Party. Reuters described him as a Soviet-educated Marxist-Leninist ideologue. And that rubbed a couple people the wrong way. And our old friend of the program, Ambassador Jorge Jaime, who is the former ambassador to India, to China from Chile, and a well-known scholar at Boston University, we've had him on the show many times, he wrote a fascinating rebuttal to some of this coverage in The Conversation, and it was entitled, "In Bamboo Diplomacy, Late Vietnam Leader Nguyen Phu Trong Left a Path for Smaller Nations to Navigate Great Power Rivalries." Cobus, let me get your take on what Ambassador Heine said, and I'm going to quote here from his article in The Conversation. He said, "While Vietnam is far from being a democracy, the one-party state does not allow much room for dissent, and there are, according to some estimates, around 160 political prisoners. That is only part of the story. Focusing on civil and political liberties to the exclusion of almost everything else, including socioeconomic development, misses much of what is happening in the global South." And I think that will resonate with you in part because when you talk about media narratives in your own research, one of the things you find is that how US, European, and global North media tend to focus much more on civil and political liberties. And the idea that somebody can double GDP, who can increase literacy, increase caloric intake, that doesn't make it into the obituaries with the same level of prominence, is something that I think is problematic to a lot of people in the global South.
Yes, I think it also misses some of the realities of life in the global South. Makes it kind of more harder, I think, for global North stakeholders to understand exactly what's going on and why some of these countries make the choices they do. You know, one of them being why they work with China so much, because of course China is such a strong example of this kind of development, you know, which is this combination of a very strong state, authoritarian state, with very strong development outcomes. And of course, that's not true for all authoritarian states. And therefore, it's really important, I think, to draw distinctions between these different countries. With that comes also the power, like of a country like China and Vietnam, in kind of foregrounding a right to development, you know, kind of on the same level as civil and political rights. And there's a lot of fights one can pick with that, but I think it gathers a lot of support, I think, through the global South, particularly because these countries are so focused on the struggles of development and the almost impossible struggle to kind of get up that hill.
Yeah, and Trom's economic policies echo in some respects the growth that we saw in China. Again, nowhere near as much as what China's done over the past 40, 50 years. But again, a doubling of GDP in his tenure is a remarkable accomplishment that I think very few leaders will ever be able to put to their name. And it shows another theme that you've brought up that we've heard from critics of China in places like Washington, who will say that democracy is the best way to grow your economy. And yet Trom and the Chinese demonstrate that even in authoritarian states, one-party states, economic growth is possible.
Yes, and democracy doesn't necessarily lead one-to-one to growth in that kind of recipe-like way. And also that the lack of democracy and the lack of growth don't necessarily always go together. One needs nuance in all of this while also making the case that democracy is, to my mind, preferable. But, there are some kind of non-democratic countries that are striking development success stories. And one finds even among Western stakeholders that when the lack of democracy and a strong development track record go together, that tends to kind of sweeten the view of those countries, even in Western countries sometimes. Like it is very interesting to see Western stakeholders always praising, for example, how efficient and clean Rwanda is. And then in the third or fourth paragraph, suddenly remembering that, oh yes, it's also like a hugely authoritarian country. So yeah, kind of even among Western stakeholders, that issue is frequently ignored.
Well, let's go back to that question of bamboo diplomacy and the way that Vietnam manages its major power relationships. Again, in many respects, there are a lot of lessons here for other middle power countries in how they can manage the great power rivalry, at least between the US and China, if not with Russia, Japan, and some of the other major powers. So for that, I was thrilled to have the chance to speak with Phan Xuan Dung, who is a research officer in the Vietnamese Studies program at the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. A couple of weeks ago, he published a fascinating reflection on the impact of Trump's bamboo diplomacy strategy in a piece entitled Nguyen Phu Trom's Foreign Policy Legacy, Shaping Vietnam's Great Power Balance. I had the privilege of speaking with Yom from his office at the Australian National University. Phan Xuan Dung, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the show. It's wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you for inviting me, Eric.
Yom, you wrote a fascinating column for The Fulcrum talking about Nguyen Phu Trom's foreign policy legacy and how he shaped Vietnam's great power balance. And in many ways, he's credited with innovating the strategy of bamboo diplomacy. Now that it's been a few weeks since Trom passed away, and people have had time to reflect a little bit on that legacy that he leaves behind, can you just share with us a few of the insights that you mapped out in that column for Fulcrum about his legacy?
Sure. I think it's fair to say that Nguyen Phu Trong successfully helped Vietnam navigate an increasingly polarized geopolitical environment marked by increasing great power competition. And, his hallmark foreign policy legacy is this concept of bamboo diplomacy. And listeners of your podcast might already be familiar with this idea, the idea of bamboo bends but doesn't break. But I think it's important to elaborate a little bit more on the concept, how Nguyen Phu Trong kind of shaped this idea of bamboo diplomacy in Vietnam's context. And, bamboo diplomacy is not a new strategy for Vietnam, really. The country has long pursued practices that now describe as bamboo diplomacy, right? So, for example, non-alignment, active engagement with major powers, and, flexible tactics. And if you look at Vietnam's official documents, then how they describe it is that, this is a foreign policy of independence, self-reliance, multilateralization, and diversification. But what Nguyen Phu Trong did is that he drew on Ho Chi Minh thought, and he used the familiar image of bamboo to describe and elaborate on Vietnam's foreign policy in a compelling manner. So he aimed to highlight, Vietnam's unique foreign policy, ascribe certain moral characteristics to it. So he talked about Vietnam's foreign policy being soft and wise, but also persistent and resolute, right? Flexible, creative, resilient, all of these adjectives that he used to describe Vietnam's foreign policy. And I think he was successful in promoting it because it not only captures the features of Vietnam's foreign policy, but also resonates well with both the public and foreign audiences. And in the current context, bamboo diplomacy helps Vietnam to balance its relationships with major powers. And I think this is Nguyen Phu Trong most important foreign policy legacy is to help Vietnam navigate great power competition. And you can clearly see that Trong himself elevated the role of the General Secretary in Vietnam Foreign Affairs. And, this is particularly evident in how Trong managed its relationships with competing powers, US, China, Japan, South Korea, and so on. And it's also reflected in the fact that leaders of these major powers, they send sympathies to Vietnam over Chong's passing, and they also send unusually top-level delegates to his funeral.
Well, it's very interesting because none other than Xi Jinping himself, within hours of Trump's passing, appeared in the Vietnamese embassy in Beijing, flanked by Communist Party's top foreign policy official Liu Jianzhao and by the top foreign policy advisor, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, as an indication of just how important this relationship between Vietnam and China is, and also the close relationship that Xi had with Trump as peer general secretaries of communist parties. So that was an indication of just how important, at least to the Chinese, that Trump was. But when we talk about bamboo diplomacy and strategic non-alignment, in many ways, Vietnam today is an example that other countries are emulating. So you see, for example, Hun Manet in Cambodia is reaching out to the Americans, the South Koreans, and others to balance the powers. And again, following a little bit of the lead of what Vietnam has done with its bamboo diplomacy. But I'd be curious to get your take on, just because they balance the powers doesn't mean they treat all of the powers equally. And China seems to outweigh some of the other major powers, even though they are all comprehensive strategic partners at the same diplomatic level. China does seem to have a weightier influence in the eyes of at least Trump and the Vietnamese political establishment. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes, I think that's a correct assessment. And, Vietnam is very well aware of this geopolitical reality that China is Vietnam's neighbor, and it will always be there. And it is a bigger power that plays an outsized role in Vietnam's economy and also its strategic outlook, right? So, of course, Vietnam pays very close attention to China's reactions towards its closer relationships with the US and other Western countries. And Vietnam is concerned about political negative reactions from China. And China, of course, has repeatedly warned Vietnam against siding with the United States and has also leveraged political and economic ties with the country to encourage, a more stable bilateral relationship. And I think Vietnam also wants to have a stable relationship with China in order to, promote social economic development, which undergirds the legitimacy of the Communist Party of Vietnam. And one of the priorities of Vietnam in recent years has been ensuring smooth and stable supply chain and also cross-border trade with China, especially after all the disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And moreover, Vietnam is seeking more Chinese investments and technological support in advancing national and cross-border railway projects. Particularly, Vietnam is expecting to start a north-south high-speed railway in partnership with China in the next few years. So China has always been an important economic and security partner for Vietnam. And of course, China is also a source of insecurity. Of course, we still have, tension in the South China Sea, right? And just one day after Charles' passing, China protested Vietnam's recent claims to an extended continental shelf, right? And Chinese vessels have repeatedly intruded into Vietnam EEZ. So again, it's a very complex relationship, and Vietnam has to manage the reality that China presents both opportunities but also source of insecurity.
It's interesting because a lot of people on the outside who are not familiar with Vietnam assume that it is Americans who may be the most sensitive political actors in Vietnam, given the legacy of the war that ended in 1975. The truth is, though, is that in all the years that I've lived there, more than 12 years now, working in journalism there and at the same time working in media, in government, with the government, very close with the government, I've never picked up any of that sensitivity. And yet China remains a very sensitive issue in Vietnam. So as you talk about the stability of relations, and you're absolutely right that economically, politically, the relations are very stable, yet the Vietnamese people have still deep-seated suspicions about the Chinese. How do they reconcile the public opinion about the Chinese with the strategies that Trump and other leaders take in terms of fostering economic relations and stable political relations?
Well, it's true that there are prominent anti-China sentiments in Vietnam's public because of past historical experiences with Chinese aggression, but also because of ongoing Chinese assertive behaviors in the South China Sea. And we see this play out 10 years ago, right, when China placed an oil rig in Vietnam's EEZ in 2014, and that triggered a major crisis in the bilateral relations. And during the crisis, we saw violent protests targeting Chinese and also other Taiwanese companies. And Vietnam realized that it's not anti-China sentiment can be a double-edged sword, right? It bolsters nationalism and the legitimacy of the party in protecting Vietnam's sovereignty, but also it could damage Vietnam's relationship with China and also Vietnam's image as a safe and stable environment for foreign investors. So I think in the past few years, Vietnam has tried to manage anti-China nationalism in a careful manner, and you don't see Vietnam kind of mention a lot of the Chinese actions in the South China Sea nowadays. What you see is passive responses to Chinese actions, and there's a tendency to avoid playing up nationalism in those instances. And I think what Vietnam also does is trying to focus on the positive aspects of relationship, right? So this is why the role of the leadership is important, is to promote certain narratives about Vietnam's relationship with China, focusing on like positive cultural exchanges, focusing on past close relations between China and Vietnam, and also the close party-to-party ties. So Vietnam also uses the media to portray that we have this very productive and stable relationship with China, and that has brought a lot of benefits for the country and for the people. So it is important for Vietnam to maintain that and to promote that instead of just focusing on, the disputes in the South China Sea. And I think the public also high confidence in Vietnam's bamboo diplomacy, because they do see that Vietnam is being respected not only by China, but also by these other major powers. And in a world where you have the war in Ukraine, right, I think the lesson for a lot of Vietnamese is that you should try to stay neutral, right? You should not take sides, even though you have conflict with your neighbor. It's important to maintain a healthy relationship. Otherwise, you could pay very high prices, right? You could be susceptible to external influence. They could trigger a major military conflict. So I think that's why in recent years, we have seen relatively calm public sentiment when it comes to China in Vietnam.
And yet at the same time, the Vietnamese reach out to China's main rivals. So they've upgraded ties with Japan. Obviously, they have upgraded ties with the United States, and they've brought in Koreans as well, both economically and diplomatically. And so when the upgrades of these diplomatic ties happen, and when, for example, the Vietnamese allow for the docking of the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier at the same time when Prime Minister Chin goes to Beijing to meet with Xi, what message are they sending to Beijing? Does this make Beijing nervous? Do you think that when the Vietnamese welcome U.S. Navy ships and upgrade diplomatic ties and really exercise strategic autonomy? Or does Beijing know that at the end of the day, they're still going to be on top in the diplomatic hierarchy that Vietnam maintains?
I think that this reflects Vietnam's also Nguyen Phu Trong's diplomatic skills in managing its relationship with China, and at the same time enhancing ties with all these other major powers. Like I mentioned, Vietnam is very cautious about China's reaction to Vietnam's closer relationships with the US and its allies. So what Vietnam does is try to reach out to Chinese leaders and to reassure China that, we have these four no's principles, right? So no allying with no formal alliance, no hosting of foreign military bases, no siding with one country against another country, and no use of force in settling international affairs, right? So these four no principles have been central to Vietnam's neutrality. And Vietnam always tried to reaffirm these principles in bilateral meetings with China and also with other leaders from other major countries to assert that, okay, we are doing all of these actions with other countries. But in reality, what we're trying to do is just to improve our international standing, trying to attract external resources to help with some of our ambitious goals. And we're not interested in joining any anti-China camp, right? So this is the message that Vietnam tries to send to China. And I think Vietnam has been successful in doing so because there was no overt negative Chinese reactions after Vietnam upgraded its relationship with the US to the highest level last year. And before that, Vietnam did a lot of work in communicating with China that, okay, this is not because we are concerned about you. This is for our own interest, right? And we have this very close relationship with the US that, we want to advance that to further utilize it for our own social economic development. And I think China has been reassured of that. And China has tolerated Vietnam's closer relations with not only the US, but also other major powers that are rivals of China.
When we look back at Trom's life, he was born in 1944 in a different era. And he is part of the older generation of Vietnamese leaders who are now starting to pass on. He was 10 years old when Dien Bien Phu happened, and that was the end of the French presence in Vietnam. And he was 30 years old when the war with the United States came to a conclusion in 1975. Reflect a little bit on this generation of Vietnamese leaders who are, again, passing on and what that means for the future of Vietnam's foreign policy, to have a generation of leaders that were not shaped by the French, the Americans, and then also the famines that took place in the 90s. This is a very different era today in Vietnam. The leaders are coming up younger. They were not necessarily raised in that era of difficulty. And how will that, do you think, change from the Trom era?
I think first, it is important to note that decision-making in Vietnam is based on collective leadership, not based on certain leaders, right? And the most important decision-making body is the Politburo. Yeah.
But that collective leadership model has come under strain in the past year, given the anti-corruption crackdown that Trom himself launched, known as Blazing Furnace, and we're looking at 7 of the 15 members of the Politburo have been dismissed. So that's been a difficult time in that collective leadership process, right?
Yes, sir. So what I mean is that, if we reflect back to after the Doi Moi reform in 1986, right? So this is where we see that Vietnam shifted from ideology-based foreign policy to a more pragmatic approach that focus on national interests. I think that is the foundation of Vietnam's today foreign policy, right? This new outlook recognized the interdependency between countries and the necessity of engaging with the global community, right, regardless of ideology or past experiences. So this shift enabled Vietnam to normalize relations with former adversaries and major powers. Right? And over time, Vietnam has actively developed its ties with these major powers to serve its economic and security interests. And so what I see is that even though you have all of this generation of leaders who experienced previous wars and who were trained based on Soviet ideology, right? They did recognize the need for Vietnam to be more pragmatic. And Chao, in many ways, he embodied, this national interest-based foreign policy, and he also elevated that with the concept of bamboo diplomacy. And what I see is that that's a very long-lasting legacy since Doi Moi, right? So I think what we should focus is not necessarily the makeup of Vietnamese leadership, but the external environment surrounding Vietnam and, how that kind of influences Vietnam's threat perception and its strategic calculation. But overall, I think that, in the near future, we will not see any major changes in Vietnam's current foreign policy because it's based on this very strong foundation that, we need to be pragmatic, we need to be flexible, we need to adapt to the shifting external environment. And, regardless of the leader's ideology, I think that's the most important factor in deciding Vietnam's foreign policy.
Well, that's just what I was about to ask you. So President To Lam is now the acting general secretary of the Communist Party. The Politburo will decide whether or not to make him permanent. We don't know for sure right now. But what you're saying is that regardless if To Lam is confirmed as the general secretary, which is the most powerful position today in the Vietnamese political hierarchy, you're not expecting a radical change in foreign policy or any abandonment of bamboo diplomacy.
Yes, I don't expect any major changes. First of all, because we have seen that bamboo diplomacy has been quite successful, allowing Vietnam to enhance ties with competing powers without serious consequences. Like, for instance, Vietnam upgraded relationship with the US without Chinese overt negative reaction. And similarly, despite US criticism of Vietnam's hosting of Putin, right? The US quickly sent Assistant Secretary of State Daniel Kritenbrink to Vietnam, and then he emphasized the high level of trust in Vietnam-US relations. So I think that, Vietnam sees bamboo diplomacy is a key instrument for Vietnam to ensure its survival in an increasingly polarized geopolitical environment. And I think any major changes would likely be the result from drastic shifts in the strategic environment of Vietnam. Of course, there are questions about long-term viability, right, in the context of growing great power rivalry and also the impacts of the war in Ukraine. But I think, in the medium term, it still remains a core component of Vietnam's foreign policy.
Well, one of the areas that may change the strategic environment is the South China Sea, or the East Sea, the East Vietnam Sea, as they say in Vietnam, or the West Philippine Sea, as they describe it in the Philippines. Tensions are very fraught there between China and the Philippines. Obviously, Vietnam is a claimant to those islands as well. What it's doing, though, is it's provoking an arms buildup in the region. So countries now are spending more and more on weapons, including in Vietnam. And that comes at a precarious time for Vietnam, when the economy is not 100% strong. There is massive corruption scandals that are being investigated right now. Some of the real estate and the property sector is showing some vulnerability, some employment issues there. And if the government has to spend more on military and less on social development, that could create some other challenges for the government. So when we look at some of the external pressures that may come down to bear on To Lam as he looks forward, the South China Sea seems to be the main concern. Are there other concerns that rival that in terms of what's happening in the Southeast Asian region?
I think that, yes, the South China Sea is one of the main security concerns for Vietnam. And what I see Vietnam's doing is strategically building up certain features in the South China Sea in response to ongoing China's gray zone tactics. And at the same time, again, trying to maintain a stable relationships with China is a very contradictory measure, but I think has worked so far. And China seems to tolerate Vietnam's build-up of the disputed features in the South China Sea. But I think more importantly, there are a lot of socio-economic issues that have been prioritized in Vietnam, right? We have the impacts of climate change, especially in the Mekong Delta. And of course, China has also plays a role in that with its dams in the Mekong. But my point is that, yes, you have this traditional security issue in the South China Sea, but again, you have to remember that, the legitimacy of the Communist parties is also based on socio-economic performance, how well it protects the people's interests and promote their well-being, right? And so I see one of the major issues for Vietnam is how to address climate change impacts in the Mekong Delta, and also how to ensure energy security, for example, right? As Vietnam has very ambitious commitments towards decarbonization and trying to promote green energy, and Vietnam has been struggling to do that. And again, it aims to become a high-income country by 2045. So there are many ambitious socio-economic goals that Vietnam does not necessarily have sufficient resources to pursue at the moment. And I do believe that this is a driver for Vietnam to ensure that it has a stable relationship with China, because China can be an important partner in that, right? Especially when it comes to infrastructure development, when it comes to continued economic growth, and also all of these other major powers, they can continue to invest in Vietnam and help Vietnam to promote all of these socio-economic issues. So I do think that in terms of the priorities for To Lam, right, there's also the need to look at all of these internal stresses and how Vietnam needs to manage all of that at the same time protecting its sovereignty.
Well, I want to close our discussion again going back to the legacy of Nguyen Phu Trong, who you wrote about and you've reflected on both in our discussion today in your fulcrum essay as well. Vietnam is often held up, again, as a case study, a model for how a developing country, a middle income or lower middle income country, can manage these great power rivalries. And let's not forget that Vietnam was the only country in the world last year in the 12-month period that attracted Joseph Biden, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping in 1 year. And that is an example of the success that it's had in managing these great power relationships. Many developing countries in Africa and other parts of the world are also learning how to manage relations with China. This is something that the Vietnamese have done since the beginning of time, given their geography. So if you were to provide some counsel to policymakers in Latin America or in Africa or elsewhere about the Vietnamese lessons in managing great power relationships the way they have, what would you tell them?
Sure. I think what we can do is, again, look at bamboo diplomacy, right? And I think this has seen us as a model for other countries. And if you look at the image of bamboo, right, and this is something that Trong and other Vietnamese leaders often refer to, you have three elements. First is that you need to have strong roots. So these refer to the principles, right? One of your core national interests, your core principles. This could be independence, self-reliance, right? It could be protecting your sovereignty and territorial integrity. The second element is solid stems. And what solid stems mean is resilience, right, in the face of challenges and difficulties. So this will be your actual policies. And for Vietnam, is a policy of independence, self-reliance, multilateralization, and diversification, right? And the final element is flexible branches. This refers to the ability to cope with multiple changes in your strategic environment and the ability to quickly adapt to adjust your strategies in the face of all these challenges. So I think, yes, you need to have these three elements. You need to know what are your core principles or interests that you're trying to protect, and you make that clear to the major powers, right? Our principles is foreknowledge. That's what Vietnam say. Yeah, we are not aligning with any major power, right, against any other major power. That's our core roots that we try to preserve, right? And then what's our policy? Our policy is trying to be friends with everyone, right? Trying to multilateralize and diversify our relationships so that we can explore many opportunities, right? So we can develop our relations for mutual benefits, right? And the final element, however, we are willing to adapt. We have plans for contingencies in cases something go wrong. We are willing to change our policy in the interest of protecting our roots, in the interest of protecting our national interests. So I think, just look at the image of bamboo and look at these three elements. I think there are a great deal of lessons that small countries can learn from Vietnam.
Those are really helpful lessons. The article is Nguyen Phu Trom's Foreign Policy Legacy, Shaping Vietnam's Great Power Balance. It's on the Fulcrum website. We will put a link to it in the show notes. And it was written by Phan Xuan Dung, who is a research officer at the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, the Yusof Ishak Institute, and a PhD student at the Australian National University. Yum, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and to share some of your fascinating insights on Nguyen Phu Trom's legacy and some of the current challenges facing the next Vietnamese administration in power in Hanoi. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much, Eric.
Cobus, this legacy of bamboo diplomacy, which is still very much in effect. So Trom's successor, To Lam, has said he's going to continue it. There's going to be no change in the policy. And we got to see it on display just this past weekend, and it was absolutely fascinating. Now, if you were a Martian and you landed on planet Earth on, say, Saturday or Sunday of the weekend, and you turned on the news to see that the Vietnamese and the Philippines had engaged in their first ever Coast Guard exercises and drills, the way that that story was framed in Reuters and in AFP and in other media outlets in the US and Europe was that this was meant to counter China in the South China Sea on those territorial claims. And while we are talking about Trom and his legacy of bamboo diplomacy, what the US European media outlets did not cover, and which we did, by the way, in our newsletter, which is why everybody should subscribe to our newsletter, is that at the same time that Vietnamese Coast Guard ships were off the coast of Manila participating in search and rescue exercises, a Vietnamese missile frigate from the Vietnamese Navy was in Guangdong province on a 5-day port of call. Fascinating how that balance was not included in the stories about the Philippines Vietnamese exercise. And those omissions are absolutely critical to understanding both why people in the West are often misled about how Vietnam positions itself vis-a-vis China and what bamboo diplomacy actually looks like in practice. This is exactly what Yom was talking about. And so I think, again, anytime you see the Vietnamese engaging in some type of activity that feels like it's tilting against China or against the US or against one of the other powers, you have to look somewhere else to find where that balance is. And this is the masterclass that I think the Vietnamese are giving to other middle power countries on how to manage these rivalries. This is what I think people in Kenya, in South Africa, and elsewhere should be studying the Vietnamese. Now, it's hard. It's not easy to study this because it's very complex, but it's really, this is what it looks like in action.
Yeah, I also think so. And it's really fascinating to see, particularly also the timing of it, kind of how certain gestures are happening at the same time as what seemingly completely opposite gestures. And also how kind of self-interest remains at the center, kind of how kind of knowing that what Vietnam needs is complicated, but also that certain factors are not going away. That China, for example, China's geographical proximity to Vietnam is not going away. That is kind of factored into these kind of very pragmatic decisions. To my mind, one of the countries in Africa that plays that role in a kind of a similar way is Angola. But I agree that the entire Global South, I think, can really look to Vietnam as the key example of how to do this.
It's interesting because on our Africa channel of the podcast, we've been talking with a lot of scholars and experts leading up to the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit that's going to take place in the first week of September. And one of the complaints, the pleas, I don't know what the word is that they're calling for, the desires is that African countries develop a strategic framework to engage China. And I think that's where the Vietnamese have done well. Bamboo diplomacy is part of a strategic framework that is thought out. The think tanks here are ordered to kind of fill in the gaps on it. Universities, they fill in the gaps on it. And there is strategic thinking in how to balance out the major powers. And Trong set that tone by creating the bamboo diplomacy architecture that the knowledge production systems here started to fill. That's what we're missing in many parts of the world. By the way, not just with the Chinese, but also towards the United States, Russia, and other major powers as well. We are in an era of strategic rivalry, and even countries that are not known for having this type of strategy in their diplomacy, I think it would behoove them to follow the example of Vietnam. Now, again, I don't want to make the Vietnamese out to be perfect. This is in many ways, a super complicated, just utterly messed up country in many respects. In many respects, it has the profile of a poor developing country where things are just not very efficient all the times. There's widespread corruption. There's a lot of problems here. So please don't misunderstand me. But they do get a few things right, and this strategic, thinking about how to manage these great power rivalries is definitely one thing. Final thoughts to you before we go.
I fully agree. I mean, I would add to that the African countries and other parts of the Global South also need more and more strategic thinking, pulling in emerging powers. With those, one actually would include Vietnam itself, but also Malaysia and particularly also the Gulf countries. Because in the case of Africa, they are playing increasingly large roles economically, and they also bring political complications that need to be managed and navigated. So I think this is another way in which a country like Vietnam acts as a kind of example, even with its many problems, of what a country of that size and that level of development should do to position itself at the center of its own strategy.
And I just want to leave with one very important thought here, that Vietnam is by no means alone. They're not unique in this respect. Prabowo Subianto is the new incoming president in Indonesia. Indonesia has been pioneering this non-aligned strategy, and Prabowo has said he's going to continue it after Jokowi steps down. You talked about Angola. The United Arab Emirates is another example of this, where they're really balancing the great powers off each other and benefiting from this in many respects, you can say. Kenya, I would put down as an example, how it can be a key partner of the United States and at the same time a key partner of China. South Africa, I don't know how well they're doing these days. I don't think that's a case study, I think, in probably not playing it very well, as they're isolating many folks in Washington. And part of the success here is making sure everybody thinks you're their friend. that is a little bit part of the kabuki that I think has to happen here. So South Africa may be a case study for some of the more complexities on how not to do things, but we should save that for a different show. So let's leave our conversation there. It was fun to be able to talk about what's going on here in this part of the world, in part because, again, there's not a lot that comes out of Vietnam. People don't know a lot about this country and this region in particular in Southeast Asia, and yet it is one of the most dynamic, one of the largest regional groupings of countries in the world, and in many ways has lessons to show the rest of the world in terms of how it does things. The key point that everybody talks about, it's been since 1979, the Sino-Vietnamese border war was the last international war in this part of the world, and that's a long record to go war-free. And so we're hoping that it stays that way, especially in the South China Sea, but a lot of great lessons. And we're going to try and bring more coverage of Southeast Asia into this discussion about great power competition. So let's leave it there. Cobus and I will be back again next week. If you love these kinds of discussions and these themes that we're bringing up, then check out our website, ChinaGlobalSouth.com. We would appreciate if you would consider subscribing to us, only $19 a month. If you are a student or teacher, email me at eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com and I will send you the link for a half-off discount. Use your academic email. And your support helps us continue the work that we're doing to provide fact-based independent journalism about Chinese engagement across the Global South. So for Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City. We'll be back again next week with another episode of the China Global South podcast. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter @ChinaGS Project and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.